All right, thank you so much. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to a special event with the New Zionist Congress, a conversation with Lahav Harkov on Israel's place in Russia's war on Ukraine. Thank you, everyone, so much for being here, the audience and Lahav. So although Lahav needs no introduction, we're going to give her one anyway. Lahav Harkov is the senior contributing editor and diplomatic correspondent of the Jerusalem Post. Her responsibilities include reporting on and analyzing Israel's relations with the world, the Prime Minister's office, the National Security Council, the Foreign Ministry, and more. She has interviewed major figures across the Israeli political spectrum and is well connected to the country's top lawmakers and diplomats. She's often invited to lecture on Israeli government and politics, and international news outlets such as the BBC, France 24, and Sky News have sought her insights and analysis about breaking news. Harkov grew up in New Jersey, making Aliyah at age 17, where she did 2 years of national service at museums dealing with Jewish and Israeli history. Harkov has a degree in political science and communications at Bar-Ilan University. And so how this conversation is going to work is that I will ask a series of questions pertaining to Israel, Ukraine, Russia, and current events between these three countries that relate to public diplomacy and international opinion. For the people in the audience throughout the event, please feel free to submit questions for Lahav to answer at newzionists@gmail.com. That's newzionists@gmail.com. I can even put that email address in the chat right here, so that everyone can see it. Feel free to send questions to that email address. So we're looking forward to reading your responses. And so without further ado, here's the event. So at the first question would be, at the beginning, there was a lot of the war between Russia and Ukraine. There was a lot of discussion about Israel's response to the war. And so before we actually get into discussing whether the narrative that formed about Israel was fair or not, can you just explain what the dominant narrative about Israel's response to the war was, and how did it become a dominant narrative?
Yeah, in the American media, within a few days of the war starting, there was this narrative that Israel was neutral on Ukraine. And you would hear people like, I don't know, like Joe Scarborough or Christiane Amanpour, who would say, like, how could this be that Israel is neutral? America supports Israel so much. Like, why doesn't Israel support America? And it became this like conflated thing where, like, if Israel doesn't behave the same way as America when it comes to Ukraine, then Israel is not, Israel is being ungrateful to America. And there would be all kinds of questions of, there was a news report that Ukraine had asked for Iron Dome, asked to buy Iron Dome like a couple of years ago already, and Israel said no. And they'd say, why won't Israel give Ukraine Iron Dome? Why won't Israel give Ukraine weapons? We give Israel all this money for weapons, so why can't Israel give Ukraine some weapons? Which, I mean, if you think the logic of that is, well, you don't want me to get into the argument, so I'll just say this is the narrative. And I felt from what I saw now that, frankly, I mean, I don't sit and watch American cable news all day, but I do read a lot of the American news sites, and I do feel like there was disproportionate attention paid to Israel, and it was in the mainstream media, at least, almost entirely from this angle.
And you would say that the main reason why this narrative came into being was because Israel was not acting precisely in the same way as America?
Or not at the expectations of some people in America, some of whom, are somewhat more are supportive of Israel. For example, like Senator Lindsey Graham, who's a huge supporter of Israel normally. But yeah, I think, I mean, again, you haven't asked me, and so I haven't really got into what Israel actually has done or any kind of timeline of it. But there was an expectation, like within a week or two, that like Israel should be sending weapons to Ukraine, for example. And because the things that Israel was doing to support Ukraine weren't exactly the things that America was doing, or in one or two cases, things that America had asked for, that means that Israel is neutral or even pro-Russia.
Got it. And so based on your review of the evidence, to what extent do you believe that the narrative that formed was actually accurate?
I mean, I think it's inaccurate, and I think that we should go over what Israel did. And the first couple days of the war, Israel was pretty quiet about it, but obviously couldn't avoid saying something forever. And within, I believe it was 2 days of Russia's actual invasion of Ukraine, Israel's foreign minister, Yair Lapid, condemned it. He said very clearly, I condemn it. He said, Israel's going to be on the right side of history. We are opposed to this. Now, what happened in that time is that the US brought a resolution to the UN Security Council against Russia. And they asked Israel to sign on to that Security Council resolution. Now, Israel is not a member of the Security Council. It never has been. And unless there's some sort of very crazy change in international politics in the UN, it never will be. And so it would have been sort of it's a gesture, right? The Security Council has a small number of members, and yet the US got, I think it was 80 countries to sign this, even though they weren't all members. So Israel skipped on that gesture, but then a day later, there was, well, I think the vote was a few days later, but the debate began a day later in the UN General Assembly on a different US resolution, and Israel co-sponsored that resolution against Russia with the US. So it was like, to me, I think it was like a little bit of an empty sort of, like they were vacillating in a way that was strange. It doesn't really make sense. It didn't make sense at the time, if you ask me, and I don't think it makes sense in hindsight either, but that was Israel's choice at the UN. However, look, Israel came out and condemned Russia and voted against Russia in the forum where it could vote. Now, as far as things that it has done for Ukraine proactively, Israel has not sent weapons. And only as of this week has Israel's defense ministry got involved in helping Ukraine, which has been in the form of helmets and vests. But you may remember that in the days leading up to the war itself, Germany sent thousands of helmets, and like Zelensky like mocked them for it. They were like, he was like, okay, thanks for your helmets. Now they need it more. But at the time, right, it wasn't like that was what people were asking for, helmets and vests, really. In any case, Israel sent, like about a week after the war started, could be a little bit more, I don't have the exact date, 3 planes full of humanitarian aid, tons and tons of humanitarian aid. And then a couple of weeks later, Israel became the only country to build a field hospital in Ukraine. So Israel was helping on the humanitarian side, helping refugees, helping injured people. The field hospital included a maternity ward, included a pediatric ward. So, you know, these are people who are really in dire straits in Ukraine. And Israel was helping them in that way. Now, if we want to talk about why Israel wasn't getting involved militarily, I mean, there are a lot of reasons. Okay, but first of all, I guess I want to talk about this narrative because you started with the narrative. There's something about it that doesn't even make so much sense in the first place, right? Like if Israel needs foreign aid in order to defend itself for its acute and immediate defense needs, then why is the assumption that Israel can spare that aid for another country, right? Just even if you don't know a lot of the facts of what's going on, it's not the most logical assumption that people were making, right? In addition to that, the government's explanation for why it was not supporting Ukraine as robustly as other countries in the West, which again, not every country in the West, right? We're not, I mean, people need to be paying attention. Not every country in Europe is, you know, I was going to say is Germany, but even Germany is, you know, it has its moments. Not every country in the West is the UK and the US, let's put it that way. Or Poland, which, you know, is on the border with Ukraine and is very helpful. But in any case, Israel has Russia on its northern border. So Israel's northern border is with Syria. Syria has been a basket case for over a decade with an ongoing, very tragic civil war. And there was a power vacuum left in the civil war because the Obama administration had set red lines that if Syrian President Bashar Assad uses chemical weapons against its citizens, the US would intervene. But then he did it and the US didn't want to intervene, and no one did. Republicans didn't want to either. It was not a popular proposition at the time. But either way, the US backed down on its red line and in the end basically gave Russia a green light to get involved. And Russia got more involved than the US anticipated, apparently. And Russia, it has been the dominant military force in Syria since about 2015. And Israel has to deal with Russia being on its border. And generally, so Israel, since the Syrian civil war started, Israel would attack Iranian targets in Syria. So in addition to Russia, Iran has a large military presence in Syria, and Israel doesn't want Iran to establish itself too close to Israel's border, and Israel also doesn't want Iran transferring weapons to Hezbollah, which is the Iran-supported terrorist group, basically right on Israel's border in southern Lebanon. So the Israeli Air Force occasionally strikes Iranian targets and Iranian weapons convoys. Once Russia entered the picture, Israel didn't want to get into some sort of fight with Russia. Israel didn't have specific beef with Russia, even if it doesn't necessarily agree with the way Russia does everything. And so at the time it was Netanyahu and Putin came up with a mechanism by which the Israeli Air Force contacts the Russian Air Force, gives them a heads up about what's going on in Syria, tells them they should get out of the way, and they sort of work that out. Russia doesn't like what Israel does in Syria and criticizes it publicly pretty often, but at the same time, they continue this mechanism because they don't want Israel accidentally shooting down their planes or killing their soldiers. Now, Israel is worried about this because shooting down Iranian targets isn't just something that Israel is doing, for fun or to show off. It's a real danger. Iran is a country that thinks Israel shouldn't exist, right? Iran is, I could talk for half an hour just about the different ways Iran threatens Israel. So it's a real threat that Israel deals with. And in the beginning of this war, there was a real concern in Israel that this deconfliction mechanism would be jeopardized if Israel was to act like, Poland or the UK when it comes to Russia. So that's one big issue. Another big issue is that there are hundreds of thousands of Jews in Ukraine and Russia. There are over 1 million Russian-speaking Jews in Israel. They basically all have families still in the old country, quote unquote. And these people, Israel wants to continue to have access and open lines of communication with these people in case they need help and they need to come to Israel. And many of them have. I mean, in the first month of the war alone, more than 10,000 new immigrants came to Israel, mostly from Ukraine, but also thousands of them were from Russia. And so that's another sort of important issue for Israel when it comes to Russia and Ukraine, and why it hasn't, say, it didn't completely stop flights to Russia, for example. Those are the big issues.
Yeah, and so when it comes to some of the specific, charges that people will bring up against Israel, actually, first, let's talk a little bit about specifically the humanitarian aid. And relative to the rest of the world, how much aid did Israel really give? Like, does it actually make a difference on the ground?
Yeah, I mean, Israel gave really large quantities of aid compared to other countries that are not directly on the border with Ukraine, right? Well, these countries, Romania, Poland, Hungary, maybe Hungary isn't exactly on the border. I'm trying to remember now. But some of these countries that are very close have been, taking in a lot of Ukrainian refugees and have been helping them a lot. And I'm sure that if we were to give in sheer numbers or money spent, then maybe those countries spent more. However, Israel, has this hospital on the ground, has sent airplane loads full of humanitarian aid, and continually, and now just a few days ago was announced more aid in the form of these helmets and vests that Ukraine asked for, and they're supposed to be going to, sort of like humanitarian aid workers, the people who need to be in the field within Ukraine.
Got it. And you also explained why Israel would not give, obviously, military aid to Ukraine. Russia is in Syria on the border, everything like that. Would the same justification be the reason why Israel has not sanctioned Russia, or is there a distinct explanation for that?
Yeah, there are no laws in Israel to apply sanctions in that way. They just don't exist. And unfortunately, the political situation in Israel would not allow for a law like that to be quickly passed. I mean, if Israel was politically stable right now, it's possible that and had like a strong, a politically strong prime minister, it's possible that he could have gone to the Knesset and been like, we need to do this fast. It's important for our diplomatic situation. I'm not sure he would have, but in theory. But the political situation in Israel at the moment would not, it just wouldn't happen for months and months, if at all. And so instead of that, Israel's sort of been taking it case by case and doing what it can. So for example, it sort of made a rule that private jets can't park in Israel for more than 2 days, so that the oligarchs can't park their private jets here. I don't think anybody's looking to park yachts here. We don't have like the right infrastructure for that. But so like Roman Abramovich, who actually also has Israeli citizenship, brought his private jet here and left 2 days later. And there have been other Russian Jewish oligarchs who did the same. And there's also been, again, like case by case things in the financial sector. A lot of the financial sector in Israel does business with the US or with the UK. And so they are taking those sanctions seriously anyway for their own reasons, because of secondary sanctions and things like that. I know of cases that people who have made Aliyah from Russia that moved to Israel from Russia and couldn't access their bank accounts in Russia because of these issues.
Yeah, and then one other issue that you had touched on actually in the original question about the idea of the Iron Dome. And a lot of people have said, why is Israel not giving the Iron Dome to Ukraine? After all, it's a defensive weapon, everything like that. Can you explain why Israel has not and would not give the Iron Dome technology to Ukraine?
The only countries that have the Iron Dome are Israel and the US. Let's start with that. It's not like Israel's giving the Iron Dome willy-nilly and then leaving out Ukraine. And Israel has, it depends, there's different estimates. The army doesn't tell people how many, but it has 10 to a dozen Iron Domes. And that doesn't even cover the territory of Israel. They often have to be moved around in times of conflict to where, to places that they think will be most vulnerable to rockets. So Israel doesn't have spare Iron Domes lying around. Now, it's questionable that Iron Dome would even be useful in Ukraine. I mean, again, Israel has 10 to a dozen of them, and it doesn't even cover Israel. And Ukraine is, I believe it's 11 times larger, like the territory of Ukraine, than Israel. So for starters, I mean, how they would need 100 Iron Domes. And the other thing is that Iron Dome was made to defend Israel from the kind of crude rockets that Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad use that, don't hit specific targets. They just aim them in a general direction of Israeli population centers. Russia has much more advanced weapons. Chances are Russia could destroy an Iron Dome very easily. So there are a lot of reasons that Iron Dome doesn't make sense. Now, Israel has more advanced missile defense weapons. I think just Iron Dome is like this brand name that people know, and that's why people keep asking it. But it really, if you understand the situation in Ukraine and you understand what Iron Dome does, it doesn't make a lot of sense.
Yeah, and so while one may understand, all these explanations that you're giving, someone might still be reluctant to accept that the way Israel has responded is adequate. So someone like Adam Kinzinger, for example, who's a congressman here in the US, has said, for example, everyone must pick a side. And he said, this is me paraphrasing more or less. He said, pretty much look at the big picture here. The history books will not look back kindly on the countries that did not go all in their support for Ukraine. And because there's a fundamental struggle going on right now between good and evil, there's no time for the kind of political maneuvering that he might describe the idea, taking into account the idea of Russia and Syria and everything like that. He would say that's just mere political maneuvering when there's this fundamental struggle going on. What would you say to someone who said that?
Well, I mean, what does all in mean? I think we could argue the US. I think Volodymyr Zelensky would argue that the US is not going all in and is making political calculations. I think every country is making its calculations according to its own national security needs. I think Israel has taken a side overall in its policy, and that it has its own national security calculations, just like every other country. And I don't see people making these same kind of criticisms of, say, Germany, which on the one hand has harshly criticized Putin, on the other hand isn't willing to wean itself off of Russian gas, and is limiting how much it wants to support Ukraine because it doesn't want to be implicated in a war with Russia. So why are the national security and energy considerations of the most important country in the European Union okay, but in Israel it's not okay?
Yeah, I think
that's just one example.
Yeah, I think it's a great answer. And so now I want to talk a little bit about so you've written two big pieces on this, one for National Review, one for Barry Weiss's Substack, about the way in which Israel responded to the war. But I noticed obviously neither of them are extremely recent. Can you talk a little bit about what, if anything, has changed with regard to Israel's involvement since you written those pieces, particularly with regards to their mediating efforts, or is it more or less the same as it was when you wrote those pieces?
Like the big thing that's changed is what's going on in Israel in the past 3 weeks or so, which is that there's been a wave of terrorism, murderous Palestinian terrorism, and then in the last week and a half or so, there's been rioting on the Temple Mount. And Israel is busy with its own national security considerations, which unfortunately are much more acute and imminent than that of a lot of the Western countries that are, the regular US allies that are supporting Ukraine. So Israel's in general, certainly the attention is much less focused on Ukraine than it was in March. However, the field hospital is still operating. And as I said, Israel announced even more aid to be sent just at the end of last week. So that's still happening. The mediation, look, Bennett still offers the mediation, but it doesn't seem to be very active. At the beginning of the wave of terror, his closest advisors told me that he's not focused on the mediation right now. But they did tell me at the time that not every phone call that he makes with Zelensky or Putin reaches the media. So I cannot say with certainty that he's not spoken to them in the last 3 weeks, but there's not been any public mention of it in terms of sort of new phone calls and new efforts.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so this is not necessarily a natural next question, but it's I guess a bit of a change of subject. But I noticed that something that struck me at the very beginning of your piece for Barry Weiss's Substack, you noted that Vladimir Zelensky recently said that, quote, when the war is finally over, Ukraine would emerge from the rubble as a, quote, big Israel. Can you explain what that means, and how will Ukraine change as a result of this war, and how does it relate to Israel?
I mean, I think so. Zelensky said that, and then yesterday, the Wall Street Journal reporter Lawrence Norman, who, if I could plug someone else, he's a great follow on Twitter if you're interested in mostly the Iran talks. I follow him for, but he had some interesting things to say about like the EU's efforts on Ukraine. So in any case, he said also an EU official said that EU's attitude towards Ukraine will be more like Israel, and I'll explain what each of those means. So when Zelensky says it, my understanding is that Ukraine will be a nation that is living with a feeling of existential threat. Its people will have to internalize that threat and will have to learn how to live with it. Will have to be somewhat of a more militaristic society. People will have to be better trained, and they will have to probably put a lot more money and effort into defense. Ukraine for 8 years has been moving towards that anyway, because Russia, because of their ongoing war basically with Russia since 2014, the lower intensity war. But that, I think, is what he means. In Israel, everyone grows up, first of all, knowing people who were killed in war or in terrorist attacks, knowing that at age 18, at this point, it's not everyone, it's about half the population, but that at age 18, they'll have to go to the army, and that it's a part of life in Israel, and we don't glorify it, but that's it. It's just part of what it means to be Israeli. So I think that's what Zelensky's talking about. And you see a lot in the Ukrainian media, people comparing Israel and Ukraine in this war, which is ironic because on social media, you see people comparing Ukraine to Palestinians. But Ukrainians feel like it's like their Yom Kippur war. Now, when I bring up the EU official, because when I saw that last night, that this reporter from the Wall Street Journal was quoting EU official saying that, oh, we're going to treat Ukraine more like Israel, I kind of scoffed at it. And I was like, oh, so you mean that anytime Ukraine tries to defend itself, you're going to criticize them and you're going to contribute almost nothing? Because that's not what they mean. What they mean is the way America treats Israel. But the EU, I don't know who this deluded European official was that they think that they're like that. I think they mean that they are going to put a lot of money into Ukraine's defense, but then Ukraine will have to defend itself. That's my understanding of it.
Got it. And so a couple weeks
ago, I will say of the EU that Germany is supportive of Israel's defense. It feels a national responsibility for that. But other than that, well, what is the EU doing for Israel?
Yeah.
Anyway, yeah.
So a couple of weeks ago, President Zelensky made quite a bit of headlines when he addressed the Israeli public. A couple of weeks ago, he compared the situation in his home country to the Holocaust, which, shall we say, ruffled a few feathers in Israel's public service branch. Why do you think this comment did not go over well with some in Israeli society? Do you think Zelensky should have said it or not? And do you think it's fair to be judging him on his rhetoric when he's obviously in the middle of a war for the existence of his country?
So I'll start with the end of your question. Is it fair to judge him on his rhetoric? I got a lot of criticism for that. Part of it was because I ended up being like a little fixated on it for several days. I wrote this initial article about what the political reactions were to the speech, and it got like picked up all over. And I was asked by a British publication if I could expand on it, write more about it. So people suddenly thought I was like the Zelensky speech critic. I think it's fair to criticize him. I don't think we needed to be like unduly fixated on it for weeks or whatever. Start with that. But he is a public figure. He did have a goal and a purpose in speaking to the Knesset, which was to try to get more support from Israel. And I think he went about it in a way that was ineffective. Either he went with what he thought was the right way to do it, or he got bad advice. And so that was sort of my point in bringing up these things that, if he wants to ask Israel for help again, he might try a different tactic. And I think that it's fair, even in wartime, to bring that up, even though, yes, I take into consideration the fact that he was speaking and still speaking out of some level of desperation. Now, the thing is, in Eastern Europe, and this includes to some extent Ukraine, there is mass denial of what the natives, the local people did in collaborating with the Nazis. And Ukraine was actually one of the worst places for that. Now, Zelensky's family history, he has people who were killed fighting the Nazis and also just killed, shot. It's in Ukraine, you had what was called the Holocaust of bullets, where people basically lined up by ditches and shot into the ground. Babi Yar in the middle of Kiev is a mass grave. The big mistake I think he made one of the big mistakes he made in his speech is that he talked about the righteous among the nations in Ukraine. I believe there's like between 2,000 and 3,000 Ukrainians honored by Yad Vashem as having helped Jews escape death during the Holocaust. But there are many, many more. I mean, the entire Ukrainian police force and beyond who collaborated with the Nazis. And to this day, the top figures of Ukrainian nationalism of the 20th century are people who actively invited in the Nazis. Now, their motivation was the Soviets have been bad to us, so we would want the enemy of my enemy is my friend. But to come to the parliament of the Jewish state and to pretend that Ukraine was a protector of Jews in the Holocaust it's obscene, frankly. So these kinds of distortions happen all over Eastern Europe. And I have spoken out about it for years, and I thought that it was appropriate to speak about it here. The other thing is, look, what is going on in Ukraine is horrific. But at least at that point, pre-Bucha, pre some of the other things we've seen, it was a conventional war. And a conventional war is not the same thing as genocide. Now, several weeks later, there are clearly war crimes being committed. And some academics have said it even reaches the point of genocide, that you could argue Putin is trying to wipe out entire cities. And that is something else. But at the time that it was happening, it was a brutal war, which was not the same thing.
Mm-hmm. And
if Zelensky gave that speech now, minus the part about Ukrainians helping the Jews during the Holocaust, maybe it would have been received differently.
Mm-hmm. So this is something that you touched on earlier about the fact that earlier, especially on social media, there were a lot of people comparing the Ukrainian cause to the Palestinian cause. And they argued that both are perfect examples of powerful countries trying to steal the land of and oppress less powerful peoples. So what do you make of this comparison?
Look, yeah, the idea of a powerful country trying to steal the land of a smaller, weaker country and oppress them is a fair description of Russia and Ukraine, but it is a completely inaccurate, distorted, propagandist's description of Israel and the Palestinian situation, right? I mean, Israel, again, this is again something we could talk about it for an hour, but you know, Israel was not established to steal land from Palestinians. The quote unquote occupation of Judea and Samaria was not Israel taking over invading a foreign country. It was actually territory that was illegally occupied by Jordan. But and a lot of these people just think that the state of Israel shouldn't exist at all. But Israel's never invaded a foreign country, ever. And the Palestinians, there was no country of Palestine, right? So it's just not comparable at all. I mean, in the case, Israel was repeatedly invaded by foreign Arab armies who were trying to destroy Israel, which is why, as I had mentioned earlier, that Ukrainians see themselves as Israel actually, and not like the Palestinians. So, a lot of people who don't know the history, and I'm sure everyone watching this is familiar with people not actually knowing the history and the real facts, and so that they think that Israel is occupying some kind of country called Palestine. But of course, that's not the case.
Yeah. And so those are all the questions I have, but the audience has submitted multiple questions. The first one being, I think is very interesting, asking, what is the opinion of Russian Jews in Israel on the war? Are they more or less likely to support Russia over Ukraine, having emigrated from there? We know that the Israeli public at large is more supportive of Ukraine, but what about this specific group of Russian Jews in Israel?
Yeah, so about half of the Russian-speaking Jews in Israel actually came from Ukraine. And they are very supportive of Ukraine in the war. I'll just give you an example that I think says a lot, which is that the Russian-speaking media in Israel, which is, their major media outlets in Israel, were all blocked by Russia for, of course, being too accurate in describing the war. But yeah, I mean, I think that people also see what's happening to their relatives, to those who have relatives in Russia, that it's just become a very oppressive situation. I mean, I have a friend who's a journalist. She was a journalist in Russia, and then she made Aliyah like 15 years ago, and she's been a journalist in Israel ever since. And she said it's like the Iron Curtain has come down again. All of her friends in Russia who are journalists, they can't speak. They're scared for their lives. So, the Russian Jews in Israel know what's going on. It's not like people who live in Russia, and many of whom are very much cut off from the real information.
Right. So the next question is, what does it say that the United States is still negotiating with Russia in Vienna over the Iran nuclear deal? Why is the U.S. seen as hardline, supporting Ukraine and Israel is criticized for not doing so, when the U.S. is literally right at this moment negotiating with Russia over an issue directly related to Israel's national security?
I'll just add to that point, which is that not only is Israel are Russia and the U.S. involved in the Iran talks together, but the Iran talks will net Russia billions of dollars because Russia is involved in Iran's civilian, or quote unquote civilian, nuclear projects. And this is, of course, all the while, the U.S. is sanctioning Russia. So a lot of it doesn't make sense. That being said, the talks have been on hold for about a month now. And the reason sort of has to do with the Ukraine war. I mean, it sort of started with the Ukraine war and then snowballed into other things. But these civilian nuclear projects that Russia is supposed to be a part of and is supposed to earn, I think it was about $10 billion. But they're supposed to get a lot of money from it. Russia wanted to make sure that sanctions on Russia wouldn't block them from getting that money. And the US said it's just a bluff and they're just being obstructive, and that sanctions were never going to block them, which again, okay, you're so tough on Russia. But in any case, in the meantime, Iran managed to bring up all kinds of new demands to the US. And so far, the US isn't giving into those demands. And so the talks have been put on hold for a while. But I mean, I know the question was put in the form of a question, but it was sort of a declarative question. And I agree with it's just absurd.
Yeah. So you talked about how there's a lot of obviously Ukrainian refugees coming to Israel. What do you think the impact of these refugees coming to Israel will be on Israeli society? Do you think it'll be significant at all, or not really?
Like, it's hard to say. I think a lot depends on how long the war goes on and whether they decide to actually stay in Israel or not. Because there is some talk that like a lot of them do not actually intend to stay. But there's over 1 million Russian speakers in Israel, as I said, and they haven't made a lot of really positive contributions to Israel. Some people say that the startup nation couldn't be without, an influx of really well-educated Jews in a lot of different technical and scientific fields. Certainly in areas of culture, like the Israeli Philharmonic. The Israeli Philharmonic was started by Jews escaping the Holocaust, and then it survived because of Jews who left the Soviet Union, I would say. I mean, like everyone's Russian practically. So in that sort of form of high culture, they've also had a great contribution. Certainly people who were young children when at the fall of the Soviet Union, or who are sort of second generation or already born here, are mostly very well integrated into Israeli society and are just Israelis. And so that's always the hope, I think, when there's a wave of immigration to Israel, that they can, you don't have to lose your identity. When I say well integrated, I don't mean like don't speak Russian. Like they almost all speak Russian. They very much tend to value that culture. But they become an integral part of our society.
Mm-hmm. So if hypothetically more Eastern European countries look to join NATO, what do you think that would mean for Israel?
I don't think it would change a lot for Israel. Israel's not looking to join NATO because Israel doesn't want to have to fight someone else's wars. And Israel basically has never asked anyone to fight our wars for us. Israel asks for money, for weapons, but not for boots on the ground usually. And so I don't think that it'll make such a huge difference. And Israel has a good cooperative relationship with NATO, and I don't see any indication that it would go beyond that.
Mm-hmm. Let's see. Is Russia's presence in Syria permanent? What would make their influence there dwindle, if anything? And what does that mean, I guess, for Israel?
That is a good question. I think as long as Putin sees it useful to him to have a foothold in the Middle East, he'll try to maintain it. And so I think Russia and Putin would have to be significantly weakened in order for them to give up on that foothold in Syria, which I suppose could happen in the framework of this war, or it could happen with the US getting itself involved, which I just don't see happening anytime soon.
Mm-hmm. Let's see. And then there's one more question, and this one's in the chat. You probably already saw it. It says, would you be able to cover Chancellor Scholz's position on not being able to support Ukraine with weapons they need, blocking other nations' efforts, trading gas, while others are trying to fight, supply, and sanction?
I mean, I mentioned Germany,
Yeah.
but I'm not an expert on Germany, and so I think better off reading other people. There's a reporter I really like at Politico for things about Germany. His name is Matt Karniching or something. I don't know how to pronounce it, but it's Matt something with a K, and he writes about Germany for Politico. So that's who I recommend you read on that subject.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so those are all the audience questions. So I guess just the last thing I would say is, if you think, just to sum up the basic, I don't know, just if let's say someone just came in for a 1-minute summary of what we've covered today, what would that be relating to Israel, Russia, Ukraine?
The nut graph, we call it in journalism, where you sort of tell the sort of nutshell of what you're trying to say. Israel is not neutral in Ukraine. Israel has condemned Russia repeatedly in words and in the UN, and Israel is supporting Ukraine with humanitarian aid as opposed to weaponry. And if its response doesn't seem as robust as, say, America's or England's, it's because Israel has its own unique set of national security considerations that it needs to weigh.
Well, thank you so much. Thanks
All
so
right,
much
thank you.
for your time. Thank you everyone in the audience for coming. Please follow Lahav on Twitter. Here's her handle. Follow her work in the Jerusalem Post. If you would like to hear more talks like this one, please sign up to be a member of the New Zionist Congress at newzionist.org. It's newzionist.org, which is right. No, newzionist.org. I don't need to put it in the chat. You can follow us on Twitter at New Zionists, on Instagram at New Zionist Congress. Thank you, everyone, again. Thank you, Lahav, again. We really appreciate the time and for all the amazing insights that you brought to us today.
Thank you.